The dark truth behind Japan's samurai codes. When you hear the word samurai, what comes to mind? Honor. Loyalty. The noble warrior, bound by a strict code. And of course, Harakiri, the dramatic ritual suicide said to preserve a warrior's honor. But what if I told you this image is only half the truth? Behind the romantic picture of the samurai, there are darker, more brutal realities: betrayal, political games, forced suicides, and codes of honor that were often more myth than fact. Today, we'll uncover the dark truth behind Japan's samurai codes. Section 1. The Myth of Bushido. The word most people associate with samurai honor is Bushido, the way of the warrior. In movies and anime, Bushido is painted as a timeless code: loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, respect, and self-sacrifice. But here's the twist: Bushido as we know it was not a rulebook that guided samurai during Japan's bloody wars. It was shaped much later. During the Warring States era, known as the Sengoku period, 15th–16th centuries, samurai were not noble knights following a sacred code. They were pragmatic survivors. Loyalty was fragile, alliances shifted constantly, and a warrior's ultimate goal was not honor but survival and power. The romanticized Bushido was systematized much later in the Edo-period, 1603 to 1868, when Japan was finally unified under the Tokugawa shogunate. In a time of relative peace, when battles were rare, samurai needed an ideology to justify their privileged position in society. So, scholars and writers emphasized loyalty, morality, and discipline, in other words, a philosophy to keep the warrior class respectable when they were no longer fighting. Section 2. Loyalty versus betrayal. If we look at the actual history, betrayal was everywhere. Take one of the most famous examples, Akechi Mitsuhide, a general under Oda Nobunaga, who turned against his lord in 1582 during the event known as the Honnoji incident. Nobunaga was forced to commit suicide as his temple burned around him, betrayed by the man who had sworn loyalty to him. This was not unusual. Samurai often switched sides if it meant survival or greater rewards. Armies during the Sengoku period saw generals betraying their allies mid-battle, abandoning old lords, or even turning against family members. Loyalty was celebrated in words, but in practice, ambition and survival often came first. Section 3. The dark reality of warfare. Another myth is that samurai fought with elegance and honor, clashing swords in fair duels. In truth, war was brutal. After battles, victorious warriors collected the heads of their enemies in a practice known as kubijitkin, head inspection. Samurai would present the severed heads of opponents to their lords as proof of their victories. Status and rewards depended on the number and importance of heads taken. This was not the image of a clean, noble duel. It was a world of blood, fear, and terror meant to maintain order through violence. Section 4. Harakiri, the truth behind ritual suicide. Perhaps the strongest image of samurai honor in the West is Harakiri, also known as Seppuku. The story goes that a disgraced warrior would take his own life to preserve his honor. But in reality, Harakiri was often not voluntary. Many times, it was an enforced execution. A defeated general or disloyal retainer would be ordered to commit seppuku, sometimes under the watch of officials. It looked like an honorable choice, but it was closer to a controlled, ritualized death sentence. Yes, there were cases of voluntary seppuku, especially to protest against injustice or to avoid capture. But research shows that the majority were compelled by authority, not noble, spontaneous acts of honor, but social and political obligations. This darker reality often shocks people who only know Harakiri from films or legends. Section 5. The Edo Peace and the Reinvention of the Samurai. After centuries of chaos, Japan entered the Edo period in 1603 under the Tokugawa shogunate. With the country unified and relatively peaceful, the role of the samurai changed dramatically. For generations, samurai had lived by the sword. But in an age where large-scale battles were rare, what purpose did warriors serve? The answer was ideology. The samurai elite needed a way to justify their status and privileges in a society that no longer required them to fight. This was when Bushido, the way of the warrior, was polished into something more philosophical and moralistic. Texts from this era, like Hagakure written by Yamamoto Tsunetomo in the early 18th century, emphasized loyalty, honor, and readiness for death. But remember, this was written in a time when samurai were bureaucrats, not warriors on the battlefield. The code was less about describing reality and more about creating an idealized identity. In other words, Bushido became a cultural script to remind samurai who they were supposed to be, even if they weren't fighting anymore. Section 6. The myth exported to the West. The Western image of the samurai was shaped much later, around the turn of the 20th century. In 1900, Nitobe Inazo, a Japanese diplomat and educator, published a book in English titled Bushido, The Soul of Japan. This book was hugely influential. Written for Western audiences, it compared Bushido to European chivalry and Christian ethics. Nitobe portrayed samurai as paragons of honor, discipline, and loyalty. For many readers in America and Europe, this was their very first introduction to samurai culture. But historians point out that Nitobe's Bushido was not a historically accurate account of how samurai lived. Instead, it was a carefully crafted image, designed to present Japan as a civilized and moral nation at a time when it was trying to be recognized by Western powers. This exported Bushido helped solidify the romanticized version of the samurai around the world, an image still alive today in Hollywood movies and anime. Section 7, Bushido as a tool of war. The story takes an even darker turn in the 20th century. As Japan modernized and built its military, Bushido was reinterpreted as a tool of nationalism and war. During the early 1900s and especially World War II, the ideals of loyalty and self-sacrifice were emphasized not just for samurai, but for soldiers and civilians. Bushido was used to justify extreme devotion to the emperor and the nation. The most striking example was the idea of death before dishonor. Just as samurai were expected to commit seppuku rather than surrender, Japanese soldiers in World War II were taught to fight to the death rather than be captured. Prisoners of war were seen as shameful, and suicide attacks, including the infamous kamikaze pilots, were glorified as a continuation of the samurai spirit. In this way, a philosophy that was partly invented in peacetime was transformed into a justification for some of the most devastating acts of the modern era. Section 8, The Contradictions of Samurai Honor. What's fascinating, and disturbing, is how flexible the concept of Bushido proved to be. In the Sengoku period, loyalty was often abandoned for survival. In the Edo-period, Bushido was written as a moral guide for a warrior class that no longer fought. In the 20th century, it became a nationalistic tool to demand sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. This reveals the dark truth: Bushido was never a fixed code followed by all samurai. It was a shifting narrative, reshaped by those in power to serve their needs. Transition to Part 2. So when we think of the noble samurai, guided by honor and loyalty, we're really seeing an image created over centuries, one part historical warrior, one part myth, and one part political propaganda. In the next part, we'll take a closer look at the most symbolic practice of all, Harakiri, or Seppuku, and separate the legend of glorious suicide from the painful, often forced reality.